All right, so our next panel is going to be on the issue of the fertility rate, and the question is, how low can it go? The recession is over, so I think it's rebounding nicely now, and we'll find out if I'm wrong. Our first speaker is going to be Louise Rollin Alamillo. She's a research analyst in the Office of Health Assessment and Epidemiology for LA County Department of Public Health. Louise has been a contributor here in the workshop for a number of years, and we're glad to have her up on the podium as part of this panel today. She has a bachelor's degree in sociology from Cal State Northridge and a master's of science in applied demography and sociology from USC. So Louise, would you come on up here? They'll bring it over here. This is how you advance it. The red little light works too.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Hi, everyone. I just wanted to say that I've been coming to this conference for probably about 2 decades, and this is my favorite conference of the year, so it's a real honor to be here. I'm going to be talking about birth trends in LA County, and so here we go. I'm going to be presenting birth trends by mother's race ethnicity, mother's nativity, age group. I'm also going to show a map of the changes by city, and then I'm just going to briefly talk about socioeconomic changes. So basically the methods are the calculation of rates. I'm mostly going to be showing total fertility rates and age-specific rates. And just because I am presenting so many total fertility rates, I just wanted to explain what they are. They are basically the average number of children that a mother will bear if today's age-specific rates were to be the same for this year. The replacement rate is 2.1 for a couple to replace themselves, an average of 2.1 kids. And the reason I'm using it in this presentation is because it's a really good rate to compare over time and between groups. And the data that I'm using is mostly birth data from the birth statistical master file. We have geocoded the addresses so that we have some geography. And I use a whole slew of census data for denominators and so also some indicators. So this is the first slide that I have, the showing data. It shows the number of births, a change from 1990 to 2015. And as you can see, there has been a real steep decline over time. In 2015, the number has dipped to 124,000. In 2016, the number's not there, but it fell to 122,000. And when I looked at the numbers recently for this year, we're already 2,000 births behind where we were last year. So the numbers keep on falling, and it is projected to fall even more. This last figure is a Department of Finance projection. This is a total fertility rate comparing Los Angeles, California, and the United States. The black line is for Los Angeles County. So in 1990, the rate is the highest. Somewhere between 2005 and 2010, Los Angeles County starts to dip below both California and the United States. It's at its lowest point now, way below 2.1. But then again, so are the other two areas. These are the total fertility rates by mother's race ethnicity. So the green line is for Latinos, red is for African American Black, and purple is Asian, black is white. So for Latinas, the rate has been declining substantially and most steeply over the entire period. But I think the real interesting story here is since 2010 is the rate for African American births has fallen below that of Asians. It's actually right above whites. It's I think it's 1.4, can't see. So So that this is a really big change, I think, and probably contrast to what a lot of people might think the total fertility rate is for this group. Also, the rate for Asians has increased between 2010 and 2015, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the reasons why we think this might be the case. So some more trends that I think are interesting. This is by nativity. I'm only showing rates for Latinas and Asians because that accounts for about 90% of the foreign-born population in Los Angeles County. But the light blue columns shows the data, the total fertility rate for 1990. The darker blue is, I think, 2000, and then the black is 2015. And again, what was surprising to me when I calculated these rates was how it's changed between foreign-born and native-born Latinas. So in 2015, the total fertility rate for foreign-born Latinas is actually lower than for native-born Latinas, which again is a real sharp contrast to what it's been in the past. And for Asians, it's for foreign-born, it's going up. And the reason we think this is happening is because I think that in the news in the last couple years, there's been a lot of stories about birth tourism. And we think this is what's happening here. It's really kind of hard to identify these births, but what we have been finding is, and just to define what they kind of are, basically this is a mother mostly coming from China that's coming to Los Angeles about 2 months before she's to give birth. She has a housing arrangement, she has a doctor, she gives birth, and then she immediately leaves, goes back to her country. So in 2005, there's about 800 births that were self-paid. This is how we're kind of thinking most of these births are birth tourism. They were self-paid, paid in cash. There's about 800 in 2005. In 2010, there was about 1,200, and in 2015, there was 4,700. And that's about 67% of all the Chinese births. So it's a really big chunk. So the reason why I'm bringing up this concept of tourism births is that when we present data, it's for resident births. And our number is actually being inflated by possibly as many as 5,000 births that are really not occurring to mothers that are residents of Los Angeles County. So the number that I presented for 124 could be as low as 119,000. All right, to move on. These are age-specific rates. This is not really surprising. They have been declining for mothers under the age of 30 for a while. But they've been declining a lot, especially for teen births. I think it's really interesting to see that the age-specific rate for teen births in 2015 is just slightly higher than those for mothers over the age 40 to 44. So those two groups are having about the same amount of babies. So the rates for older mothers over the age of 35 has been gradually increasing. And basically, in 1990, the group that had the largest amount of babies was the 20 to 24. Then the next decade after that, it's 25 to 29. And then after that, the next decade is 30 to 34. And this is just, I'll just go over this really quickly. This is the mean age at first birth. And basically, it's showing that for white women, the average age is around 30, I think it's 32. Yeah, 32 in 2015, the same as for Asian moms, which is a very high number. It's a little bit more than 2 years over for the national. So nationally, for white women, the rate is 29. So this is one of the reasons why the births is increasing for mothers over the age of 35. All right, so here's our map. I'm comparing 2007 and 2015 births, and basically the red areas are the decline in births over the time. So the darker the red, the bigger the decline. The darkest red is over a 30% decline in births. And then the gray areas are the increases. So there's not very many gray areas. Just notably, the areas with the biggest declines are El Monte. The city of Los Angeles has 20% fewer births, which I think is about 12,000 fewer births in 2015 compared to 2007. Pomona has declines, Inglewood, Compton, East Los Angeles, El Monte, Southgate, Norwalk, Downey, Long Beach. They all have at least 20% decline in births, and this is just 7 years, within 7 years. So now I'm just going to move quickly into, I'm not going to talk about change in migration. The only thing is that during the 2000s, there was actually, I think probably because of migration, there were less women of childbearing age between 2000 and 2010. And since 2010, the number has been increasing, but it's interesting that the births are still decreasing. I'm not going to talk about that one. So I'm just going to look at socioeconomic factors. I'm going to look at unemployment rates and how that corresponds with births. I'll look at mothers' educational attainment, by birth rates by that, and then also changes in how births are paid for, including private insurance or Medi-Cal. So the purple line is the unemployment rate, and the red line is births. So this kind of talks a little bit about the recession or the effect of the recession. So when unemployment rates started to climb, birth rates did decline. But as you can see, the unemployment rate's actually as low as it was back in 2007, but births are still continuing to decline. This, I think, is a really interesting slide. So for mothers that are having babies with less than a high school education, when you compare 2006 and 2015, you see that the biggest decline is in mothers with less than a high school education. It's a humongous drop compared to 2015. There is an increase in mothers that have a high school education, a high school diploma, and it's almost no change for the other two groups. And then lastly, there's a lot of numbers here, but this shows, again, the difference in births by births that are paid by Medi-Cal. It's the top part of the table, and the bottom is private insurance. And I think the real big information here, the takeaway, is that Medi-Cal paid births have fallen steeply, I think around 29% over those 2 years. And the bulk of that has been in the Latino population. So they've also fallen for private insurance, but not nearly as much as for the Medi-Cal population. So I think that we can probably safely say that lower income populations are having less births than the rest of compared to the rest of the population. So that's pretty much my presentation. Basically, births are declining and they haven't stabilized. We're not sure when they're going to stabilize. The declining, by race ethnicity, it's declining for African American and Latinos and increasing for Asian moms. And that might be primarily due to birth tourism. And it's continuing to decline for women under the age of 35 and increase for older women. And it seems to be associated with socioeconomic factors, so that poorer women are having less babies than other women. So that's my presentation. Thank you.
Wow, that was a gold mine. I've got a zillion questions. We're going to get to them later, though. Boy, oh boy. So our next speaker is going to be Ethan Sherrigan, who joined the California Department of Finance as a demographer in 2014. He holds a PhD in demography from the University of Pennsylvania, which many people think is the best demography program in America. If I can say that, I don't know. And he's responsible in the DOF for estimates and forecasting of rates of fertility, mortality, and migration, and conducting the next series of California population projections. So anything you don't like, you can blame it on Ethan. He's here today, and you should corner him on the coffee break to tell him what you don't like. But first, we'll give him a chance to explain himself, and then we'll have some Q&A also. So Ethan, you want to come on up?
I have to say, if you have comments on our projections, that window of opportunity has unfortunately closed. We do those consultations in the fall, so you'll have to wait until the fall again to get that in. So as Dawal said, I'm going to present some statistics about fertility in California, specifically about low fertility. Then I'll present the results of our current forecast of the fertility rate we published in this spring of this year. And I'll provide, if there's time, some thoughts on why fertility is low from the perspective of, if we can understand why it's low, will that help us understand how low it might go, or what factors might cause it to turn around, maybe to increase. When asked to talk about low fertility, there are a couple of options for framing the discussion that come to mind. We could talk about births, which have been trending downward. Births have been trending downward. Even as the births have been trending downward, the number of women aged 15 to 44 in the state has been increasing. That might be the most important metric, number of births, if you were a hospital deciding whether to build a maternity wing in the next few years, or if you're a school district interested in projecting enrollment. But when we're looking 50 years out into the future, as we do at DOF in the projections, we have to talk about rates. And even small changes in rates compounded over 50 years have big effects. Dawal graciously didn't show some of our projections from the 1990s, which had us not only going to 50 million, but to 60 million by 2040. So we try to not publicize those very much, but be honest about them. We still do provide those older projections to people who request them to be transparent. But it's a moment of hubris. Those results were not just due to fertility changes, but fertility change and fertility assumptions were a big part of that. So here are our national trends superimposed with Californians. As Louise was explaining, when demographers talk about fertility, we're generally talking about age-specific rates. We're talking about the cumulative age-specific rates, which add up to the cumulative number of births for one hypothetical woman. That's plotted here on the left for the California on the right by race and ethnicity. So like the general fertility rate and the total births story, the total fertility rate has declined during the past decade to just below 1.8 today. California has generally followed the US trend, but what I'll point out that is despite the state story being similar overall to the US, the stories for each of the race ethnic groups in California is very different from the story for the same group in the US overall. So it's not just the case that California has a different population mix, a different demographic mix than the rest of the country, but actually the age-specific rates for each of these groups is different than it is in the rest of the country. And with the exception of Asian and Pacific Islander fertility, which Louise talked about a little bit, our reasons for the volatility there and for the high numbers there, with the exception of that group, every other group in California has lower fertility than their counterparts in the US. In other words, if we had the same race-ethnic distribution as the US on average, we would have much lower fertility than we actually do right now. But we know California is kind of the vanguard demographically for the rest of the country, so if anything, the rest of the country is going to start to look more like us. Despite that, so I talked about how California has followed a similar pattern of decline as the US, but that fertility is structurally much different than the US. So we might think of not making comparisons just to the US, but let's think of California as another country, and let's try to draw some richer comparisons by comparing California to other countries and not just the US. Here's the world range of TFR, the 5th percentile at the bottom and the 95th percentile, and then the world average fertility, which is around 2.5 right now, 2.5 children per woman. California's in the bottom half, so let's just increase the scale here so we can get a little more detail. 2.5 children per woman. Let's add California for the past 10 years. I could add it longer, but we're interested in the recent level. And I want to start adding countries that have reached the same level that fertility is at right now, around 1.7, 1.8. I'm going to start plotting them on the year that they were at that level on the x-axis, and let's follow what happened after the point that they reached California's level, where they went from there. I selected them more or less randomly from this figure, tried to pick ones that wouldn't make the figure look too busy, but there are a lot of countries that are at the level where California is now. The first one just came up was Belgium. Reached Californian fertility levels during the mid-1970s. Fertility there has remained low. It's never returned to a level higher than it was. But it didn't ever get to what we call the very low or the lowest low countries. It never really fell below 1.5, but it never got back up again past 1.8. I'll add Italy next. Italy and Spain, very similar. They reached this low fertility level and they continued past it. So they're really the vanguard of the lowest low fertility countries. Fertility in those countries fell to about 1.3. It's recovered a little bit, but TFR in Italy and the southern Mediterranean are still the lowest in Europe. They're below 1.5 children per woman. Japan has been low throughout this entire period, but it kind of reached the level which California is at during the since 1990, there's been just a decrease and very little increase there too. Positive story here, if you're interested in increasing fertility, is France. France was, interestingly, the first country in Europe to experience fertility decline during the Industrial Revolution. In 1990, it was about where California is today, and since that time, fertility has kind of inched upwards. So it's now at replacement level, more or less. It's slightly below. Looks like it may have leveled off of the increase. These are kind of a little bit smooth, the TFRs here, but France is maybe a positive story. It's very well known for being a pro-natal country, a lot of institutions there to support births, and it's also had a lot of immigration too. There's a pretty high percentage foreign-born. Here's Canada. It's getting kind of messy here, so apologies for that, but Canadian fertility is it's just below Belgian right now. The lines kind of look similar. It's been low and stable, 1.7, 1.8 Californian level for a long time, very little change. The individual trajectories, I think, are not the most important. We could pick and choose which country we think California is most like, but I wanted to kind of get a range of outcomes for what's been happening to countries that have reached low fertility. What stands out to me is that these countries were all between 2 and 4 in 1960, and they're all now under 2. None seem to be on the verge of a reversal or a change in fortunes. I also noticed that actually California fertility fell much faster in the recent decade than most of these countries did when they were at the level that we're at today. So I wanted to see what these countries looked like in the past and if they ever had equally rapid declines in fertility. So now it's really spaghetti, it's much worse, but I just wanted to see that there's a much higher range in fertility here, and then most of these countries also experience, like California, very similar steep, rapid decline in fertility. And what that suggests to me is that California's TFR may not yet have bottomed out. If you want to see a rapid slope decrease, we're looking back at the 1980s in those countries. But I wanted to compare now what's been forecast for these areas. So we have our forecast for California. Let's look at the UN forecast, also in 2017, very, very recent, for these countries. Things get interesting here because the UN is forecasting that regardless of what level the total fertility rate is in these countries, they can't remain below 1.7. So they have them going up to 1.7 by 2060. None really ever reach replacement, much less go above it. And like ours, the UN projections have been consistently revised downward during the past 15 years. They used to assume convergence returned to 2.1, then in the 2000s, 1.9, and now 1.7 is the minimum level of long-run fertility that they really allow there. And for California, we see that it could decrease below that level to about 1.6 before there's any turnaround on the horizon. So it looks really lower than these peer countries. And I said California is probably not as low fertility as Italy and Spain and so on, but by 2060, it may be. But that's partly because these other countries have experienced low fertility for a lot longer than California. So although California is at the low end of the projections in 2060, that may be reasonable given the process of transition to low fertility as a norm, which these countries went through much earlier. And to illustrate what I'm kind of thinking about there, I'm going to shift California back a few decades so that the slope over the past 10 years matches with these other countries. So if we shift back and we imagine that this transition happened in California in the 80s, then we'd be basically having the state following the same pattern of development these other low fertility countries. And if you were to extend this TFR forecast out another 40 years, like to 2100, for example, which we did as an experiment, you do get convergence to a similar trajectory, a little bit of an increase in fertility rate. You can kind of see it already beginning to reverse. And by 2100, it would increase to 1.7 or higher. So it would match that UN threshold for fertility in the projections. So we don't ever project that California is going to join the club of the very, very low fertility countries. It's never going to go below 1.5 in our projections. And these things are all represented, the reasons for that, and the age patterns, which I'll show soon. So that leads to the next question. How did fertility get to be this low? There are a lot of reasons. It's not the focus of this talk. I'll try and get more into that in the afternoon sessions, into our projections in detail. But the first point is that any theory of low fertility, of how we got here, has to explain the aging of mothers as a group. By that, what I mean is that there's fewer younger women and more older women having children. That's what I've referred to here as the proximate cause of low fertility. So here's a plot of the observed age-specific fertility rates. We talked about the total fertility rate, which is the bottom right here. Louise also had plotted a little different way, but a very similar plot of the age-specific fertility rates by age in the top right. That's the age pattern of fertility that I want to kind of highlight. And so like Louise was talking about, we have this shift in the peak ages of childbearing. As recently as 1990, 20 to 24-year-olds had the highest age-specific fertility rates in California. By 2000, the peak had moved right. From blue to red, you can follow it. By 2000, the peak was now 25 to 29-year-olds. And as of a couple of years ago, it's now 30 to 34-year-olds. And if we look at the individual age-specific rates, there's a lot of interesting things happening, a lot of crossovers happening in the very near future or the very recent past. The birth rate for 40 to 44-year-olds is just about to overtake the teen birth rate for the first time ever. So that's something to watch. At some point, we do expect the growth in the fertility rates for these older women to start offsetting the decreases in fertility rates for younger women, which is the reason that TFR levels off. So if that's how low fertility is materialized, what were the underlying causes there? It's not a simple question, but there's 5 things that I'll just start the conversation to talk about. First is education. Education has 2 effects. It delays births while you're in school. And second, it really does change your vision for your future and your plans for having kids. I referenced here a really great study by Amin and Behrman that find among identical twins raised in the same family, controlling for IQ and birth weight, anything else that you might determine your likelihood of going to school, those that just happened to get more education or decided to get more education, they have children later, and they have smaller families in total than their identical twin siblings who had less schooling. Then there's contraceptive technology, especially the pill, which just really came at the right time for many Western countries where women were looking for ways to control their fertility. I'm not saying that contraception has had an influence on the fertility rate, but it allows people to more accurately realize their fertility intentions. Male contraception may not be far off, which could be another important thing on the horizon. In any case, technology is part of the story. There's some literature, although I don't think this is very well developed. There's some literature on how housing affects fertility. There's a couple of interesting papers that find the fertility of renters is sensitive to housing prices. Fertility of homeowners doesn't respond very much, which maybe indicates homeowners have already kind of realized what their final fertility ambitions are, and they decided to purchase housing that reflects those ambitions. There's also some interesting evidence that access to mortgage finance has an impact on the fertility rate, which can explain some of the very low fertility rates in Southern Europe, where mortgage access is very, very low. And the economy is important too, especially the changing nature of work. It's the reason we're encouraging more school, because not only school hopefully is fulfilling, but there's an economic return to human capital in the economy. Many good-paying jobs require college specialized training. So I'm going to move on and just conclude here that fertility decline is likely to continue, maybe even accelerate with more automation. Finally, there's social factors, there's social norms. We'll talk about more of these in the afternoon session. But California is, in general, it's typical of developed countries at a similar income level with the state. The fertility rates in California are low, but there's a large role in population growth in the state that's played by immigration. So the size of the Californian population in 2010, at the time of the last census, is almost the same as Uganda and Poland, which is an interesting comparison I like to make. Uganda has grown a lot, Poland has decreased. California has the same fertility rates as Poland. So the reason California's population has not declined is, as Dawal talked about, foreign-born immigration of adults, and then it's children of those foreign-born parents who then become native-born Californians. And the last point to make is that there's geographic variation in our projections we do at the county level, and we do project that there are regions of the state that won't follow this story at all. We have the Central Valley, for example, remaining at 2 children per woman, not changing very much. So, thanks for your time, and look forward to talking more about this in the afternoon sessions.
We are so full of facts now, we need to get some interpretation. Louise and Ethan, would you come down here to these chairs? And we get some microphones over here. We'll then have Q&A now. I'm going to move it up because we were behind schedule. And I'm dying to ask questions of our 2 speakers. I'm going to use my own microphone too, but let me start with this. There's so many facts. We might want to ask questions about the facts, but I think we can go deeper and ask about the interpretation. So I'm going to put a question to both of you, and give a quick answer, and we'll have maybe a chance for 5 different questions. So, I am very taken by the fact that we have a bunch of old mothers. I can't believe it. It used to always be that people who were 20 were the most likely to get pregnant and have a baby, and now it's 30 and over 30. And I know that because my daughter-in-law is having a baby this week. Yeah. Which I'm pleased to say makes me a granddad for the first time. But you wait till after 30. All right. So maybe, here's the question. What is up with California women? What's causing this? Louise?
Well, I mean, is this working?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I think obviously there's a lot of the things that Ethan mentioned, the contraception. I think also, I really do think that it's the housing prices and the job market, all that really means that older women are waiting to, I think, I'm speaking a little bit from personal experience, until we get those things, to have children. I know that in the surrounding counties, it's not the same story. There's a lot of younger mothers still in San Bernardino and Riverside, but for Los Angeles, I think that's why actually maybe some migration out of the county into those areas has been happening, and as a result, I think that's why older mothers are having their babies now. And I don't know if it's going to continue to be to the point. I found it interesting you were saying that 40 to 44-year-olds are going to surpass teen pregnancies. Is it going to also surpass 20 to 24-year-olds at some point? Is that what it's projected?
I have to look back at the figures. I don't think we have going that high. No.
Yeah.
But
So that's amazing.
So you gave the LA, ground zero picture, but now Ethan's got the whole state.
Right.
It shows up in the whole state as well.
Yeah, in fact, I would emphasize the education story. I really think that's the strongest. If you have to come up with a single reason that explains delayed fertility, later fertility, and lower fertility, I think it's the education story. It's remarkable. We showed a lot of changing trends in rates. We showed changes in age-specific rates, changes in rates by race, ethnicity, but the one thing we didn't really show was changing rates in education. In fact, there's not much change in rates by education. The rates in fertility, the fertility rates by education level are pretty constant. So I think that the story about low fertility and later fertility is really a story about people moving their life off of the below college to the some college or the college and more kind of fertility schedule.
Yeah. Well, so Ethan, again, this is for you, I guess. So in addition to the birth rate, there's the tempo at which generations replace themselves. So if people are having babies at age 20, you could have 5 generations in a century. If they're having babies at age 25, it's 4 generations in a century. At age 33, it'd be 3 generations in a century. So what does that do to the overall growth rate then for the population?
Well, it's not just that, but there's also the fact that technology is changing and social norms are changing so fast. I mean, I have a brother who's 3 years younger than me, and I already think he's part of a different generation. So that compounds things. Yeah, I think social norms change incredibly rapidly. I think that it's really important to, you probably ought to be asking these questions too of young people, asking them, people who are college age or who are thinking about going to college, and what are their plans for fertility? How many kids do they want? When do they think they're going to have them? Because these things change so rapidly that I don't think the experience of my age group is representative.
Well, another way to think about birth rates is as a barometer for society as a whole, not just for the women, but for society. And so I'm going to give this to Louise. So what does it mean? What does it mean? What does it say about California and the changing life in California? What's happening with the birth trends?
Well, I think that we kind of are ahead of a lot of other states. Again, I think it's going back to just how difficult and possibly how expensive it is to have children here. And so I think we're leading the way. I think, one of the reasons why the Department of Public Health is looking at this is because we wanted to know, what are the health outcomes related to these changing birth rates. And so we're looking at older mothers having babies and how that might be an added cost, because there's a lot of costs with infertility treatments. And before we used to spend, I think most of our messages are tailored for teen births. And the teen births are so low that now it's makes more sense to direct some of the education to older mothers, and maybe even the possibility of the advantages of having babies at a younger age. So I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Yeah, let me follow up my question for you. What does it mean that teen births are so low? What does that say about the average experience or the future potential of the average woman in California if now it's so rare to have births under age 20 and more likely much older? What does it say about women?
I think that just generally they're just generally having them older.
But does it benefit them? Is it good or bad?
Well, it's I don't know
This
personally.
is beyond the numbers here. I want to.
But it's definitely beneficial in a lot of ways, in terms of you may have a higher education, you might have more income, you might be more financially well off when you have your children, and that will cause a lot less stress for mothers. I don't know. I think that's
It's just different from the 1950s.
a lot different than the 1950s.
Ethan, do you have?
Yeah, I mean, I think most of the benefits, well, plenty of benefits of children accrue to the parents, so I shouldn't be totally dismissive of that. But when we're talking about low fertility, we're not generally worried that women who don't have kids are not going to feel fulfilled in their lives or are going to be missing out on something. When we talk about low fertility, usually talking about the stability of economic institutions, the stability of social institutions. If we don't have kids, who's going to pay for retirements? Who's going to pay for Social Security? And that's usually what we're concerned about when we're concerned about low fertility. And I think in the case of California, we don't really need to be so concerned about that. So I think it's a win for the state. It's a win for those women who can control when and how many kids they want to have because of technology. And the state, as long as it's able to make up that population gap in kids due to immigration, that's the really open question, because we owe all of our population growth. We had an inquiry came to our office where there was I think a newspaper or something, which was asserting that immigrants were accounted for like 75% of the population growth since 2000. And so we decided to do a fact check on that, and it turned out that it's closer to 100% than 75% once you include. If you look at the children who had at least one foreign-born parent, that's 100% of the population growth since 2000. So without immigration, California would look like these other countries in Western Europe. We really depend on that, and as long as that can continue, there's not really a downside to the state for women having fewer children.
Wow, you're telling me that the reason I was slow getting here this morning, all that traffic congestion is because of these immigrant babies being born? Is that what you're saying? I mean, so if I could get rid of all that, I would then free up I get the cars out of my way.
Do you have a pension plan?
He says, do I have a pension plan?
Because if you do, you should say thanks to those kids.
This is not a state institution. But you basically are seeing a happy balance, that you think it won't go too low.
Yeah, I mean, the fertility rates will go very low, but the thing is those kids that were missing because they were never born, they kind of magically appear at working ages. They come to California, they work, and they start to have kids. So they kind of jump right into the ages where there's peak fertility rates. And so they kind of they prevent us from going to a decreasing population, and they keep the population very, very stable. Our projections are below 1% growth, but they're still growth. Yeah. So, yeah, that's what's important. We're not going to be in that club of countries which has very little immigration and similar fertility rates, which start to have negative.
I just wanted to add something, though, but I think for Los Angeles County, anyways, the number of births for foreign-born Latinas in 2000 was like 70,000, just a huge number. But in 5 years later, it drops to 45, and in 2015, it's 30,000 births. So it's more than slashed in half, by a lot more. And that's only, I think that's over, over 10 years. I think it's 2005, 10, and 15. So this is foreign-born. So here, I'm not sure if that's...
Well, but your data showed that among Latinas, those who were native-born had higher birth rates than those who were foreign-born.
Right.
Which is a reversal of the past.
Right. And that's new, too. That's as of 2010.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So is that related to the birth rate in Mexico? It's one of my favorite showstoppers when I'm talking to public audiences, is asking what the birth rate is in Mexico, and they don't know.
Yeah.
Do you know what it is?
I'm not sure. I know it's declined significantly, but I don't know.
There's debate. The Mexican data don't agree with themselves, but I think it's 2.2 babies per woman in Mexico. It used to be back in 1970, it was 6.0. And so it's really slashed. So they're coming from the country has low fertility when they arrive, where they're coming from. Right. It's a new world. And that's also why we're getting fewer Mexican immigrants, because they have plenty of work to do back home. There's not enough workers in Mexico. We used to be the overflow, and now there's no overflow coming. So it's like, okay, we'll get it from China and India, I think.
Right.
I don't know.
That's where they're increasing. That's where the births are increasing.
Births are high.
Yeah.
Well, not in China, but in India.
Yeah. Also in Los Angeles.
So these things then link together. So the fertility rates then feed off of the migration, but they also can cause migration. So it's really, and then they also feed into aging.
So when you say fertility rates causing migration, you're thinking about this issue of shortage in the labor force. So fertility rates are low, you have a demand
Well,
for
fertility rates
workers
in the
to
home country will depress migration to here if it's low fertility. And then we want them more because we have fewer of our own babies, and so there's a shortage. People are fighting it out. I'm glad, Ethan, that you compared different countries, and I'm glad you compared California to a country. You know, you all know, right? We're the 6th largest economy by GDP in the world, so it's.
I decided we do it all the time for economics, so let's start doing it for demography too. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it makes sense to look at us that way. It was really useful to see us compared to Belgium and France. Now, France has a substantial migration from Arab countries, right. From Morocco and Tunisia and across the Mediterranean. It's so close. So it's similar to us.
They've also had these policies of, it's been historically very easy to repatriate to France if you're from a former colony. So they've been very, very aware of low fertility in France for a long time, and it's been a problem, that's discussed in public policy. I mean, how often do we have, a president or even a governor who talks about the demography of the state? But in France, you will have debates on demography at high levels of.
Yeah. Well, the thing that for me, the great social policy takeaway is that nobody's having too many kids. You can't blame anybody for having too many kids. And in fact, maybe there's not enough kids, and so the ones we do have, we should maybe take care of better, because we need them to be higher producers than we took for granted back in the olden days when we had too many kids. So people, by and large in politics, one of my rules I've discovered is that people have ideas that are 20 years old. And that's not clear why. It's because they came of age 20 years ago and it stuck with them. I won't name names, but there's President Trump. His ideas, I lived in New York City, his ideas are 1980s New York. That's really a lot of what shapes his ideas. And he's building a wall against Mexico and Mexican migration. That's a good idea for 1990, but it makes no sense today. So everybody does that, though. It's not just him. Everybody thinks about 20 years out of date. And when things are changing so rapidly, how do you get them to think about it? I mean, how do you show it to them? I mean, these changes that you showed today, both of you, surprised me. I'm a demographer. I'm supposed to know things, and I still got surprised.
Yeah, it's just a lot of change. A lot of trends are changing. I was very surprised by the findings too, like that foreign-born Latinos have lower total fertility. That African American Black women have lower fertility than Asians. That there is a spike in Asians in terms of fertility. So, I mean, in Los Angeles County, the number of births in 2015 is the same number that was in Los Angeles County in 1979. But we had 7.5 million people in 1979. We have over 10 million now. So it's these are very surprising. And I was very interested in how you mentioned that these are very sharp in in California. So it's very interesting.
Well, we reached the stop sign. We have to stop now. There's more that can be said. These are our two speakers. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.